Hello, welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint a Legio Fureans, also known as the Tiger Eyes, Reaver Titan for Adeptus Titanicus. We're going to be starting with the Carapace. So we're going to be using these three colours. They are going to be applied using an airbrush. So the airbrush that I'm using is like a Cult of Paint one, but it's basically an Infinity CR Plus airbrush. It's quite an expensive one. But you don't need anything that good really. I'm using a size 0.4 needle, and the PSI will be around about 30-35ish. And you can see here how I'm going to dilute the paint, ready to be airbrushed through it. So what I did there was I had a needle, and I filled it up with Vallejo airbrush thinner, which allows me to be more precise with how I fill it up, and it also means I can just leave the liquid in there, and I can just, every time I change colour I can just quickly put a small amount into the cup. You put that in first, then you use another brush and just take whatever colour you're using. So to start with I'm using Yriel yellow, and then you just touch it to the side of the cup and then swirl it round. This means that the paint will mix in with thinner, ready to airbrush it. You can put some water in as well, but because it's such a small amount, I find it's not really worth it. But using that process means it's much quicker to change colours. And here you can see I'm just airbrushing it on. Now you will notice for a start that the black primer will show through a bit, because yellow is a very translucent colour, and so it's going to take probably 3 or 4 layers to get a really nice opaque finish. Now that's what I do for all the armour panels. But I did actually get a little bit bored. So, a quicker way to do it is if you use something like, say, XV88 first, and you give it a quick coat of that, you'll get you'll get a nice yellow finish much quicker. Now, there is a little caveat to that. If you do the XV88 first and then put the Yriel yellow over the top, it will look a very flat opaque yellow, but it's still technically, and because you're not doing as many coats of yellow on top, it's not going to be quite the same colour as a perfectly opaque Yriel yellow. However, as you add more of the shading thing, so here you can see I'm shading with Mournfang brown, and you probably see there might be a few speckles of paint and things when you do this. Don't worry, the process is going to hide all those as we go along. There's no great airbrushing skill required for this. It's very, very simple, straightforward stuff. But the main thing for getting the Mournfang brown down is just to put it in the sort of more recessed areas. So the area that's going to be underneath the gun on top of the carapace, and the sections at the side, and leave the very front of the carapace as the brightest yellow part. It just creates a little bit of shape and definition on there. So doing these layers on top and things, it's going to hide any difference. So probably the best way is to do something like XV88 first and then do the Yriel yellow, just because it'll be a bit quicker. But as I said, it won't be quite the same as a perfectly opaque Yriel yellow colour. So here I've gone back to Yriel yellow, and this, so you're just very gently fading this over the top of the Mournfang brown that you just put on. So it doesn't matter too much if you were a little bit heavy-handed when you applied the Mournfang brown, but applying the Yriel yellow over the top, it will hide the speckling, and it just help blend everything in. Because remember, Yriel yellow is it's got poor coverage, so that's just another way of saying it's very translucent. The layers underneath show through when you apply it. So like one coat of this, or maybe 2 coats, it will just soften it down and create a much neater transition. Another way to do this would be, instead of going straight to Mournfang brown, would be to mix some of the Mournfang brown in with the Yriel yellow. So that will save you actually having to change the colour in the cup. You can just add a little bit of the Mournfang brown in, but you just have to be careful with how much you add, because it is quite a strong colour. But it means you will get like a softer spray for the transition. So it's really up to you how you do it. And then the final colour that I'm putting on here is Flash Gitz yellow. This is basically a highlight colour. Keep this to the very front of the carapace, and maybe the kind of the rounded edges at the side. But don't go back. Don't go anywhere near the Mournfang brown that's already on there. And there you go. A very simple, clean airbrush. You can see there's hardly any speckling on it now, just because of that extra layering, but it's got some nice fade in there as well. Now onto the trim. This is very simple, using Necro Gold from scale 75. You do want to thin the paint slightly. I find it's quite thick to start with, so around about 50-50 water to paint, and then just paint all the trim. The trim is probably the worst thing in painting Adeptus Titanicus models. There is so much of it. Even painting something small like a Warhound, there's a lot of trim on there. If you don't want to paint the trim in the way that I'm going to be doing it, it's fine. You can just do layer the gold on and then give it a wash, and that'll do. If you just want like a simple wargaming piece, it will still look nice and detailed by painting it that way. My problem is I get a little bit kind of obsessed with painting the details, so all my trim gets highlighted and shaded, and that's how I'm going to show you how to do that. But because all of the trim gets highlighted and shaded, it does mean that it takes a long time. And if you've seen some of my other videos, particularly for something like the War Master Titan, because there's just so much trim on it, when you highlight and shade all that, it sends you a little bit crazy. So here, I'm using the same steps. So as I said, you paint it all gold and then you give it a wash. You can stop, like if you're painting a few Titans at once or batch painting them, you can do all this for all of them, and then they'll be ready for gaming pretty much. Like they won't have any detail on as such, but they'll look good on the tabletop. So I'm using Agrax Earthshade here. For anyone wondering as well, every now and then off the side of the camera you can see my magnification headset popping in. I like to use that. I'm using it more these days. I don't really like to use it. I find it really uncomfortable and awkward to use actually, but it does save my eye strain. A few people have asked me before which one I use. I can't remember the name. It was just a cheap thing that I found on Amazon. I've tried a few different ones, and to be honest, I find them all awful. I must have a fat head or something, because I find they dig into my temples a lot, and I can't wear them for long periods. But they do, really save my, save me getting any eye strain. If people are interested enough, I might do a video specifically on headsets, because I know there are some more expensive ones out there as well, and I'm probably going to end up getting one of those instead, as I use them more often, just to because I paint so often, I don't want to strain my eyes too much. So now this is the most important part that I'm doing of the Legio Fureans, and this is the black flames. Now there are a few different ways of doing the black flames, and me being me, I'm going to freehand it all. You can get decals for it, or transfers. Forge World also do some really nice ones. The only thing that I find is they're very specifically shaped. I think the pattern repeats probably a little bit too much, and because of the specific shapes, they just stand out as a pattern too much. Now that doesn't mean to say that you won't make the same mistake, or I won't make the same mistake even, by doing the same kind of movements over and over, but they will be varied enough that it just looks a little bit more interesting. Also, the benefit of freehanding them is that they will fit the shape exactly, whereas the decals will, they'll all be kind of like the same size. So if you have them curving round an area or something, they won't fit it exactly. You have to cut them all up, and you probably have to do a bit of freehand with it anyway to make it all fit perfectly. The flames that I'm painting on, so you can see how I started off. I just paint these very rough kind of S curved lines, and you can be quite loose with how you paint them on. They don't have to be neat. You don't have to worry if you get like a little bit of a wobble in there or something like that, because once you've blocked the positioning in, you then spend the time is spent kind of just flaring out some of the curves, so you get like very large curves going into thin lines. So it's just a case of extending some of the curves out, and then when you get to the base where near the trim, so it's important that you don't spend too much time painting the trim in terms of highlights and shadows, because you're probably going to catch the trim a little bit with the black paint. So if you just only take the trim to this stage and then finish it off at the the very end, you're less likely to have to fix any mistakes. But you see where the flames touch the trim, you want kind of like a small black chunk, and that will go like all the way along the whole edge, so the flames are kind of rising off of something. It gives them a base for the flames to come from, because otherwise they'll look a little bit weedy. I have seen other people that paint the flames on. Now, the way I've done the flames is there's going to be quite a lot of flames on there, and they're going to be it's more detailed, but you can have a more visually striking image with the flames if you do them much bigger and chunkier. And the thing is, it'll be a lot quicker as well if you do them bigger and chunkier, but it's just a case of they won't look as detailed. But I do recommend, like, if you are going to freehand flames on them, that you Google it, see some of the variations that people have done, because it's good to get ideas as well, just to see how all the flames look, and then you can kind of like pick and choose what you think looks the best or whatever. The brush that I'm using is a size 00 Artist Opus, although if you look at the tip of it, you can see it doesn't actually line up with the centre where the bristles go into the ferrule. That's because I've chopped a load of the bristles off. The brush was wearing out. It's quite, the tip was very worn down, and I thought instead of just retiring it or moving it to a different for a different technique, because I like kind of fat tips on my brushes as well for different types of marks. But I wanted some very fine tips as well, still with long bristles. So I just cut a load of the bristles off. So the bristles themselves are, sharper at the tip still, but I can get quite long, thin lines as I paint on there. However, I really recommend you don't do that to your brand new brushes. And indeed, like if you've got a new brush, you probably get away with just using that instead. But this, if you have a worn out old brush and you just want to see if you can bring some life back into it in terms of painting some high detail, it might be something to try. Whatever you do, don't pull bristles out of the ferrule, because that will dislodge them all. You might have to make sure you cut them off at or before meeting the ferrule. So looking at the freehand that I'm doing still, I think it's pretty straightforward. I am using Vallejo model color black. I find that's my preferred black to use. You can get away with using Abaddon black if you want from Games Workshop, or any black you like really. But I do find the model color black is a little bit more matte, a little bit more opaque, just easier to work with in terms of doing this sort of detail. Because you can thin it down a little bit and it'll still make a nice opaque mark, and it'll flow nicely, whereas some of the other paints, are probably they're not quite as opaque when you thin them, or they might be a little bit shiny or satin with their finish. The only thing is, like, if you prefer a satin finish, and obviously go for something like that, like Abaddon black that has a more satin finish, it will look more black because of that satin. Look like richer and darker, but because of the satin thing, it will catch the light as well, so you have the obvious satin shine on there. So it's really down to your preference. However, I will be using some matte varnish on top of this later on, after I've done some of the decal work. So really, it doesn't matter too much, I suppose, but I just find the model color paint a little bit easier to work with in this particular case anyway. While you're doing these marks as well, so a few things for the type of marks I'm making. If you notice, a lot of the marks are pulling the brush towards me. You'll get a much cleaner, more controlled brush stroke if you pull the brush towards you. Don't paint away from yourself because the tip might flare out. You don't get such a neat, controlled mark when you do it. And also, don't worry too much if you do make a slight mistake. You can, as long as you have a very small amount of paint on the brush, so load the brush up, rub it on your thumb. So you see lots of people with paint on their thumbs. You can see me there. I've been putting paint on my thumb just to drag the excess paint off and make sure that the tip of the brush goes to a very sharp point. So that will allow you to do very detailed, careful marks, and the paint won't blob out when it touches the model. It does mean, though, that as there is less paint on there, it will dry quicker, so you have to work a little bit quicker as well. Here I'm just giving the Carapace a quick coat of gloss varnish. Now, you might notice there's a little bit of dirt and debris in there. That was my stupid mistake. I have my well palette there, and I put some gloss varnish in, and I just put a bit of water in just to water it down so it was a bit more fluid as I applied it, because it was quite thick out of the pot, and there was dirt in the well palette, and I just couldn't be bothered to fix it. Now, because I'm going to be weathering these, it's not such a big issue, but if you want a very clean model without any of these, the dirty look to it, it's a good idea to make sure that anything that you're mixing with water and going to apply to the model is clean, because otherwise you're going to get all these horrible little sort of like dust or old dry paint particles and things going on there. So here I'm going to be using some of the Forge World decals, and this is kind of like my favorite one, the eye. Now, if I was wanted to do something that was a bit more for display standard, I would freehand this. That's not to say that you can't use decals or transfers for display level painting, but I just find it a bit more interesting if I do my own freehand stuff. I am going to be painting a Nurgle infested Warlord Titan as a Golden Demon piece, and again that'll be an Adeptus Titanicus one. I'm not going to paint a giant 40k scale Forge World Warlord Titan for a Golden Demon piece, because that would just take me too long. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to freehand all the symbols on, because they can then be Nurgle corrupted ones, and I'm not going to be using any airbrush and things like that. So it might be interesting to see that process. But in terms of this, so I'm just applying the decals. It's very quick and easy. So, and you may have noticed I only used the micro set. You do get microsol and microset. I never bother with the microsol. I just don't find it worth it. If you put the microset down first, then put the transfer on top of it, so you have some behind that will allow the kind of like the vinegar type stuff to eat through the plastic of the decal from behind, and then you put it on top as well, so it does a better job of just destroying the plastic film on it. Then once that's dry, by the way, so the reason for putting the gloss varnish down means that the surface is a lot smoother for the decal to rest on. The only thing that I did on this that I usually, or that I didn't do on this, I usually do when applying decals, is once the decal's kind of set in place, but before it's completely dry, I'll get a cotton bud and just roll it over it so that it pushes out any of the bubbles that you can see on there. It's not the end of the world, like if it dries and there's still a couple of bubbles in it, but on these larger transfers, you can sometimes get a bubble that is in the middle as it's dried. All you have to do is like just stab it with a needle or something, or a scalpel, and then you can still push the bubble out. But if you can do that while it's still slightly wet, and you'll get a really perfectly smooth finish. And then you can see I'd already. Then once that's dry, you gloss it, and that's dry. Then you matte varnish it, and then you have this finish. So here you can see I'm doing some oil weathering. And it's super, super quick and easy. The main thing to look at, so you can see the tip of the brush there that I'm using. So this was an old brush, and I cut the tip off, so it gives it a very flat head on it. So it's quite fat as well. And then all you have to do is put the paint on. So I'm using Burnt Sienna. Just blob it on. Then I take this short little stubby brush. I dip it in the mineral spirit. Dab that on some kitchen roll or whatever, so it's only just slightly damp. Then just drag downward strokes towards me, very soft, simple marks, and you get this lovely streaking effect. Super quick and easy. And on previous Titans, I've done it where I would do this streaking effect when on top of a gloss varnish, and then matte it afterwards. But what I found is it's not really necessary to do that. You can just work on top of if in this case it was obviously matte varnish because I'd done the decal there, but there are going to be other places on the model where I painted all the armor panels, and they're not going to be varnished, and so you can still do the oil weathering on top, and it's not going to affect the paint layer beneath it. So the final thing here for the weathering is just to do some small scratches and dents and things. Super easy to do as well. It's just a case of Rhinox hide paint, putting some little dots and dashes. Try not to be too excessive, like unless you want like a really weathered model. But just a few little dots and dashes all over the model, and then just take some ice yellow or dawn yellow. That's a very similar thing from Games Workshop. And then you just paint the lower edge, and that gives it that sort of three-dimensional look. And again, I'm using the paintbrush that I use that is slightly customized, so some of the bristles are cut off. It just allows me to do some very small detailed work. What also you can do is if like me you didn't clean your palette when you were putting some of the varnish on, and you've got like dirty bits on the model, and they stand out too much, you can turn those into scratches as well. So it's not the end of the world if there are very obvious marks that have got mixed in with the varnish. And here you can see I did go back with the Burnt Sienna oil, and I just did like a couple more dabs on the model where there are scratches, and then just drag those down as well. So now we're going to be highlighting and shading the trim. And again, this is purely optional. Just bear in mind that it will take a while because there is a lot of trim on the model. Every single armor panel has trim all the way around it. So if you're going to do this, you've got to do all of it. So the first thing is you can actually apply the same Necro Gold back over where you first applied it, because after the Agrax Earthshade it's now darker, so that will work as a first stage highlight. Then I've used some Vallejo chrome, and mixed that in with the Necro Gold, kind of like a 50-50 mix. Now you can do more or less chrome depending how much you want the highlights to stand out. Now I'm doing my highlights really quite bright. I wouldn't recommend going up to complete chrome. It's just it's too much. Already like it's a very bright highlight when I apply it, and also it might be a case of that you're quite happy just using Necro Gold as one highlight, that because it still works as a highlight and it just keeps it a little bit more subtle. So it's entirely up to preference. Don't feel just because I've done it in the video a certain way or use a certain colour that you have to stick to that. You can tweak it however you want. And all I'm doing is I'm looking for... So these aren't realistic highlights. The highlight placement is where I think it will look interesting for the curves. Because I'm doing this as like a 360 degree model for the overall lighting. There's just no realistic lighting on this model at all. This is purely for kind of a gaming style of painting. But even when I do the Warlord Titan, the Nurgle one, it's going to have a similar sort of idea for it. So it'll look the same from whatever angle you look at. They'll all be highlighted and shaded to the same. So it's a little bit different for me in that regard, because I quite like different light sources. But for something on this scale, it's not, especially for a gaming piece, it's not so such a suitable style of painting to do. So it's 360 degree style, so it looks the same all the way around. I find this is a little bit better for this scale and type of model. So you just place the highlights where you think they'll look good, and it's usually on a curve which will naturally catch the light anyway. And then you go and paint all the edges with the highest highlight color, obviously leaving some of these recesses. And then I've used some Wildwood contrast paint, and then in the darkest places where you want it, you just go and paint some of this on. Again, super simple. It's just not very quick. You'll probably find that as you do it more, so as you progress along the all the different armor panels, you will get a lot quicker at doing it. It's kind of a pain. Right, so now we're on to the main structure of the Titan. There's a few little interesting points here. First of all, here you can see how I painted the structure on other parts. Like I did this beforehand, just so that I've got it nailed for when I do the video, so I know exactly how it's going to go. So starting with a black primer, and then I'm using again a Vallejo metallic colour, and it's burnt iron, and I'm just kind of stippling it on. Now if you want, you can dry brush it. It gives a slightly different mark. I like the stippling look. It gives a little bit more of a worn feel to it. You could also just airbrush all the metallics on if you want, but again, it's going to give a different finish, going to give a very sort of smooth finish. And you'll see why, after all the processes are done, why I prefer this look, because it keeps the metal really, really dark and kind of oily and grimy looking, which contrasts nicely against the bright yellow armour. A couple of things that you might notice, although just off the bottom of the screen at the minute, so the toes. When I built this model, so I've got the stepping forward thing, well, if you rewind the video and you compare the toes there to when they were black, you'll notice that the front toe is on the wrong side of the foot. And I noticed this while doing the video, so I had to cut off the two front toes and swap them over because I put the wrong feet on. I originally was going to have the other foot stepping forward rather than his right foot, and I noticed it in the video, and I built it incorrectly, so the feet were on the wrong legs, and I couldn't pull the whole foot off, so I just cut the front toe off and swapped it over. But anyway, you see there, after the burnt iron dried, I gave it a coat of contrast Magos purple. The contrast paint works nicely. If you don't have Magos purple, like a wash will probably work as well, just a darker colour. So it's working in conjunction with this sort of stippling effect, and having the wash over the top, it dulls it down even more. So it's already like a really dark metallic effect. And now I'm using the Mournfang brown, and I'm just turning this into a wash. And I'm just adding water, so you don't need any special mediums or anything like that to it. You don't need like Lamium medium. Doesn't really matter. Just water is fine. Just mix it up. You need a lot of water. It's probably like 8 or 9 parts water to paint, and so you can see here the Magos purple's dried, and it's dulled the metal down. Now, and it's really important that you make sure that it's all dried before you do this. And then you can see I'm just going to slap this Mournfang brown on, and just go wild with it. But anywhere that pulls too heavily, go back with your paintbrush, kind of like wash the paintbrush off, dry it out, and then just carefully dab any areas where it's pulled too much, because you don't want like a very heavy brown dried patch. Now it's going to look very messy while you're applying it. Don't worry about that. That's not an issue at all, because it's so heavily watered down. It looks like there's kind of like a lot going on, but as it dries, as all the water evaporates, and then you can see like the final result, it just looks sort of like kind of grimy. Like it's a really nice effect, well, I think anyway. But it's completely up to you if you want to do this effect, but I think it's quite effective. So now I'm going to paint the metal cylinders in between. I don't know if these are pistons or not. In the official artwork, it doesn't make sense they're pistons because they've got nowhere to go. But they're always painted in that kind of way, as if there is some level of movement in them, and there's always like grease in there as well. So they're painted as kind of bright metal. Now in other like Reaver Titans, and indeed other Titans in general that have these sort of cylinders on them, I usually paint it up to chrome. So I use Vallejo, the metal colour, so they're quite large, with the black lids, the pots, kind of like this one. But I found that the chrome was maybe a bit bright, so I mixed it slightly with the burnt iron colour, just to get that effect. However, at the end of it, I actually kind of prefer the chrome. Again, it's up to you. How you do it. It looks very bright in the video because the light's catching it, but like if there's not a strong light when you're just looking at it, it just looks a little bit duller. I mean, it still stands out, but it's basically whatever you prefer. So now up to the kind of like the hip sections. Now you can see that I've painted these copper, and then I'm giving them a wash of Skeleton Horde contrast paints. Now, I painted these, and at the time, like I've been planning to do this for a while, and I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I've seen other people paint them, but I thought, right, I'll do them a really bright copper colour, and they'll stand out as a very separate metal. But you might be thinking, hang on a moment, Richard. I see the picture at the beginning of the video, and these aren't on it. And that's right. When I finished the model, I took the photos, I looked at it, and I was like, I don't like it. The verdigris copper look, it works all right, but it just doesn't work well against the yellow of the armor. I preferred just all of the skeletal structure to be like a dark metal color. So after I did this and I'd completed the model, I just went back, painted it black, stippled on the burnt iron, wash of Magos purple, wash of Mournfang brown, job done. Very quick and easy just to fix it. And it's not to say that this effect isn't good for a verdigris kind of copper effect. So if you want to use this for something else, that's fine. It'll still work. It just, in this case, I didn't think it suited the look of the model. And so the verdigris, I was a little bit bored at this stage, so I'm doing it quite quick, so it probably didn't help with the final result. But kind of like you just sort of slap it on there into the recesses. So the idea is it'll stay more in the recesses naturally, but then it would get worn off on the bigger curved areas. And then you sort of like stipple blend it around so that you don't have very obvious brush marks on it. And again, I could have done that a little bit better and neater. Might have turned out a little bit better. So what I did here was mix in some of the black oil paint, Winsor and Newton black oil paint, with the Burnt Sienna. So it's not mixed with any mineral spirits at this stage. I just paint like a thick layer around the very top of each of these possible pistons. And then, because it's oil paint, the nice thing is you don't have to worry about it drying too quickly or anything like that. It's going to be pliable for a long time. So you just slap it on there. Then again, you go back to the thick brush where I cut the tip off, and you just very gently sort of blend it in. It gives a nice soft transition down into the metal colour. And again, don't do this with, like, if you've got a new brush, don't use a new brush. Just use an old brush that's worn out, and you can cut the tip off that. Then it's kind of like gives it a nice use. I do recommend, like, if you dip the brush into the mineral spirits and then kind of like dry it off it on a piece of tissue paper or something first, before you use it to sort of blend the oil paint down into the metal, you probably get like a slightly better result as well. So now finally I'm going to show you how to paint the head on the model. This is I did this, and it's a bit more involved than it needs to be. So using a black base, and then I'm just using some grey paints. I'm using German grey and dark sea grey, and then I mixed in a few transitions as well. Now you can over highlight this. By that I mean you just take it too bright, so you take the highlights too bright, and all I'm just doing is looking at the kind of like the edges. So it's got some soft curved edges on the shape of the head, and you just sort of building it up. It doesn't have to be super neat. It's kind of hard to see the way the light's hitting it because of the it's a fairly dark grey at this stage. Here's the dark sea grey being mixed in as well, and I'm kind of like just sort of smushing it on there. I just did this because I wanted the head to stand out a little bit differently, but ultimately if you wanted, so the other reason that I did was because I'd already painted on the metal and the trim, and then I was like, I should have just airbrushed this. So in reality, if you want to do this quicker, when it's prime black, take your airbrush, put some grey paint in. So like start with the the German grey, like a dark grey colour, give it a quick coat of that, then add in, you can even, if you want, you can just add some white to the German grey just to get it slightly lighter grey, and then give it another coat just in a smaller area, just picking out like the front bits. And you'll get to the same process way quicker than I did here, painting it in. But it will give a slightly different effect. And if you want, like if you don't have an airbrush, you could paint all of the yellow doing it this way as well, but it'll take you a long time, and I really wouldn't recommend it. Like if you're going to paint an army of Adeptus Titanicus Titans, I strongly suggest that you get an airbrush for painting, if you're going to paint them yellow, because it's a lot of work to paint like a solid clean yellow colour by hand. So you can see, I'm just picking out the highlights with that sort of like smushy, stipply kind of transition. If you find at any stage that the highlight that you're putting in looks too bright in comparison to the layer next to it, just add a bit of the previous colour into the highlight so that the tonal jump isn't too high, and it'll blend in a little bit easier. So the more transitions you have for your colours, ranging from black to light grey, like say if you have like 6 or 7 transitions, you'll be able to do very soft transitions from one highlight to the next. Whereas if you only have like 2, so you have like the German grey and then the dark sea grey, when you apply the dark sea grey on top of the German grey, it's like a massive tonal jump, so the dark sea grey will stand out a lot, and you probably won't be happy with that result. But after you've finished painting these highlights on, don't worry too much if you've got, say, too much dark sea grey in total. Like if the head looks grey instead of like black with grey highlights, don't worry, because in the next stage we're going to knock it right back so that the highlights are only just visible. But as you can see, I'm doing like a sort of a stipply kind of motion. But it's not a very it's just not a very quick method of doing it. But I mean, it also is kind of nice having like a hand painted armor effect. If I was doing it properly, spending more time on it, as I said, I'm going to be painting the Nurgle Warlord Titan. That's all going to be done by hand, so the effect will be a little bit different from an airbrush Titan. I do like airbrush Titans because they look very clean and bold, but they do lose a little bit of the hand painted effect with the you don't get any kind of like slight brush marks or variation, or kind of you lose some of this sort of interesting little brush marks that appear by painting it all by hand. And also, you don't have to spend time cleaning out your airbrush, because although it is a lot quicker to airbrush a model, it is also a pain having to maintain them. And again, just looking for those sort of little ridges, very soft curved ridges on the head of the Titan, just to pick them out a bit. So there I've gone and just finished it off. It still looks a little bit ropey, to be honest, but as I said, don't worry too much. So now I'm going to use Corvus Black, Games Workshop colour, and all I'm going to be doing is glazing. So this is watered down. It's around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and all you do is you load up your brush. I'm using a size 1 Artist Opus brush. Load up your brush, rub it on some kitchen roll so there's hardly any paint left on it, and you are just like going over the whole area, starting at the highlight point and then dragging it down into the shadows. Now you probably need quite a few layers of this. It's going to knock back all of the greys, it's going to blend them all together. So if you've not done a very good job, like I haven't here, blending them all in, glazing over the top will just make a nice transition with all of the grey colours, and as I said, it will dull it all down as well, so these bright highlights won't be quite as bright and obnoxious as they are. But you just be careful. Like, you can go a little bit over the top with the glazing here, and if you dull it down too much, then when you paint on the kind of like the weathering, then you won't be able to see it. So here it is glazed down. So now I'm using the base colour, which was the Vallejo model colour black, and all I'm doing is same as I did on the yellow armour panels, just some very quick dots and dashes just to do some sort of small scratches on there. They're going to be harder to see, but that's just natural because it's like a black armour, whereas so it's there's not a big tonal difference between the weathered scratches and the armour panel itself, whereas compared to the yellow armour there's a massive difference. Now obviously I used Rhinox hide when doing these scratches on the yellow armour, but it's not going to stand out very well on this. Now if you wanted to paint some streaking coming from these, so using the Burnt Sienna for kind of like rust streaks, that will show out really nicely on this, but I just couldn't be bothered. But like if you want to, or like if you've got a lot of black armor panels, then the streaking will look really nice on them. And then again, for same thing as I did with the yellow armor panels, except this time it's using the light grey, so it's the dark sea grey, and just picking out the lower edges of any of the little dots and dashes on there, so it looks like it's got a few little chips and things. You can also, like, if you've after the glazing, there's still a few patches where the blending looks poor. You can use these scratches and things to kind of hide it. So, again, don't worry too much if you didn't do a very good job for blending any of the grey colours together. You can hide a multitude of sins by putting weathering over the top of it. So the final thing that I'm going to show you is painting the little lenses on the eyes. These are a bit tricky just because of the size on them. It's a very standard way that I'm going to paint them. It's how Games Workshop pretty much paints a lot of their lenses as well. But because these ones are so small, you don't have to do much in the way of transitions. So Sotek green, don't water it down too much. That's really important. It needs it to be quite thick. You might even be able to get away with just using it straight from the pot, but each pot is different, so don't take that as standard. Test it first. It needs to be able to come off the brush. If it's too thick, it's no good. So you put your Sotek green down, you cover like about 2/3 of the way around, then add a little bit of white to it, so it turns into a highlight. Then to go over like 1/3 of it at the bottom as well. You can see I went back there, messed it up a bit, tweak it a little bit here and there. It doesn't matter too much, so I went back with the Sotek green there. It is a very blue colour, by the way, Sotek green, in case you're wondering. Then I'm going back with the little line again at the bottom. It is quite important that you get a good amount of Sotek green on there, because when you put the white highlights on, because it's a small area, you are hiding the Sotek, like you're painting over the top of it, so it might not look with that that greeny blue if you haven't got enough Sotek green on. So you can see there, put a little white dot at the bottom in line with the line, then a white dot in the top left, and it just looks like a little shiny lens. Very I say simple to do, like it's tricky because it's a small area, and you can see there I've done it on the other side as well. And here you can also see how I got rid of the copper hip joints. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. Please subscribe. As I said, there's going to be more videos to come. I've got a lot of things I can't show as well because of things I've signed, but they'll all be shown eventually. And lots of, so I've got things for Adeptus Titanicus, I've got things for Age of Sigmar, and I've got things for 40k. But thank you very much for watching. Don't forget I have my Patreon and website as well with more basically. But again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.